As people interested in geography and nature, it's usually quite easy to define a country or region with a single word. Brazil, rainforest; Egypt, deserts; and Norway, fjords. But when you play this same game with Africa, things get complicated. Do you describe it with vast savannas? It's a forest? Or maybe it's mountain and rivers? The truth is, Africa is all of these things at once. A continent of unmatched natural diversity. Yet, when you look at its political map, something feels strange. Unlike other continents where borders often follow mountains, rivers, or coastlines, Africa's map looks like it was drawn by someone using a ruler. Straight lines slicing across deserts, squares and rectangles cutting through intelligence. Lines that seem to ignore geography, rivers, and even a people. And that's because, in many cases, they did. These borders were not drawn by Africans themselves, but in faraway European capitals during the late 19th century, as the consequences of those decisions are still shaping the continent. But to understand why Africa borders make no sense, we have to go back to the winter of 1884. In Berlin, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck invited the great powers of Europe for what became known as the Berlin Conference. The agenda was simple: carve up Africa. At that time, Europeans controlled only about 10% the continent, mostly coastal outposts and colonies. The vast territory was largely unknown to them, but with the Industrial Revolution hungry for raw materials like rubber, gold, and ivory, the European powers were ready to take more. Over the course of few months, 14 countries sat around tables in Berlin: Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, and the others. They pulled out maps, many of them shockingly inaccurate, and began to draw mountains, rivers, and the people who actually lived in Africa barely mattered. What mattered was avoiding conflict among themselves. So with pens, rulers, and colored pencils, they cut the continent into pieces. Britain got large stretches from Cairo to Cape Town. France claimed the vast land from Dakar to Djibouti. Belgium took the Congo, an area almost the size of Western Europe, as the person of the property of King Leopold II. And just like that, the map of Africa changed forever. Within just 30 years, over 90% of the continent was under European control. But what looked neat on paper in Berlin became chaos on the ground in Africa. The most destructive effect of those borders was how little they affected the people living there. Africa is home to more than 3 ethnic groups speaking over 2,000 languages. Before colonization, kingdoms and communities had their own borders, shaped by rivers, forests, trade, and migration. But the Europeans ignored those realities. Entire nations were split apart. The Somali people, for example, found themselves divided between 5 modern states: Somalia, Ethiopia, Djibouti, Kenya, and Eritrea. The Iwi people were split between Ghana and Togo. The Maasai were cut between Kenya and Tanzania. In other cases, completely unrelated groups were forced together into new countries. Nigeria alone has over 2,000 ethnic groups, including the Hausa Fulani in the north, the Yoruba in the west, and the Igbo in the east. These groups are distinct histories, cultures, and systems of governance, but were suddenly jumped into one colony simply because Britain drew the line that way. The slicing and stitching communities planted seeds of division. What might have looked like just lines on a European map become run through families, cultures, and histories. These artificial borders didn't just create awkward maps, they also fueled the conflict that continued to this day. In Sudan, the North and South were pushed together despite deep cultural, religious, and ethnic differences. This eventually led decades of civil war, ending in the creation of South Sudan in 2011, the world's newest country. In the Horn of Africa, Ethiopia and Eritrea fought a brutal war that killed tens of thousands. The roots of the conflict borders drawn by Italians and British colonial administrators. Rwanda and the very tragic history of ethnic violence also traces back to colonial borders and policies that amplify divisions. Even today, disputes continue. Morocco and Western Sahara, the Democratic Republic of Congo and its main neighborhoods, the border between Ethiopia and Sudan. These flashpoints remind us that the colonial lines are still alive, not just on paper but in political and in blood. Borders don't just divide people, they also divide economies. In Europe, borders have become softer over time. Trucks can cross from France to Germany with barely a stop. Trade moves easily across borders. But in Africa, colonial borders often act like walls. Customs checkpoints, tariffs, and long delays is often easier and cheaper for an African country to trade with Europe or Asia than with its own neighbors. For example, moving goods from Lagos in Nigeria to Accra in Ghana, a journey just of a few hundred kilometers can take a days of paperwork, inspection, and bribes. This slows down economic growth, makes food more expensive, and weakens regional cooperation. The African Continental Free Trade Area, launched in 2018, is one attempt to change this, but the ghost of colonial borders still looms large. Despite all of this, Africa is not just trapped by its past. The continent is young, with the fastest growing population in the world. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on Earth will be African. Some readers argue that instead of changing the borders, Africa should focus on making them less important. Through integration, trade, and regional unity, the African Union, created in 2002, dreams of a continent where borders don't block cooperation. The very thing that colonial borders try to suppress could become its greatest strength. From Lagos to Nairobi, from Kinshasa to Cape Town, Africa's future is being written by Africans themselves. When you look at Africa's map today, it is easy to see only the problems in those strange rural straight borders. But it's important to see the resilience. For more than a century, Africans have lived, adapted, and created within these artificial lines. Yet, the borders may not make sense geographically or historically, but what makes sense is the determination of Africans to shape their own future. And perhaps, one day, the map of Africa will be remembered, not for the line drawn in Berlin, but for the connection, unity, and possibilities created by Africans themselves. If you enjoyed this journey into the story of the African geography, don't forget to like this video and in the comments share your thoughts. Cheers.